Oh, fuck off! Are you kidding? Oh. It's not exactly a secret that the Callisto protocol has huge problems, but the issues it has, both the ones relating to combat and beyond, are by and large not something you could fix in a few afternoons. This game has a startling amount of flaws that run so deep, I felt compelled to go through them, if only so I can share the suffering I experienced across my 4 playthroughs. Technically 4.5, if I'm being honest.
What have I done?
So why not get the big one out of the way first? Because it really helps to contextualize some of the other problems I have with this game, as it bleeds a little into some of the other issues. As it stands, the melee combat in this game is overpowered to an absurd degree, to the point that the knowledge I can rely on it removes almost all tension from combat regardless of the difficulty. And unlike in a game such as Dead Space, melee combat is not an afterthought, it is a core component of this game. I don't like just summarizing systems, but it is necessary to explain how this combat works, since I doubt too many people have played this game, and of the ones that have, they will have done their level best to forget about it. So, to anyone who has beaten this previously, you're welcome for the return of traumatic memories. The melee system in its simplest form goes like this. An enemy approaches and attacks. You move either left or right, and Jacob will automatically dodge the attack regardless of when you started moving. If the enemy does a follow-up, you must move in the other direction or you will be hit. Repeat until they're done with their combo and counter with your own. Your combo will sometimes be 3 hits, sometimes less or more, but as far as I can tell there is no rhyme or reason to when Jacob will perform a longer or shorter combo. He seems to just do it when he feels like it. Repeat until the enemies are all dead, move on. You can also block attacks by just moving back, but dodging is so incredibly easy there's only one attack in the game that you should be blocking rather than dodging. Problem number 1. There is no moment-to-moment engagement with this dodge system. Sure, the game has a directional dodge, but the direction you dodge doesn't matter until the combo starts. And when it does, the attack pattern is entirely predictable. It always alternates, and once that first attack comes out, you know you have to dodge the other direction. It's not as if you have to dodge right if an enemy opens a combo with their right arm. You just dodge either direction, and if the enemy keeps attacking, you alternate and you'll be fine. So instead of watching how my enemy attacks, my eyes just glaze over and I walk in one direction until I see movement, and then I walk the other way until the movement stops and I can attack. When combat starts, I already know exactly how I'm going to tackle the fight. It's all planned out in my head. Only, instead of feeling rewarded for having an I see the code moment like Neo, I feel like Phil Connors in Groundhog Day. There are many ways to make games with predictable, easy combat engaging, from giving you additional specialized party members or a wide berth of attacks. RPGs typically have dozens of different enemy types across your playthrough as well. I'll get onto enemy variety later, but in regards to moves, in Callisto you have a couple combos and a heavy attack, and that isn't an exaggeration to make the game seem worse. When I say you have a couple combos, I mean you literally have 2 melee combos at your disposal at maximum for the entire game, and one of them isn't even really a combo. I would actually argue it's more of an exploit, since the game never acknowledges its existence. But I'll get onto that later. This system is very rigid. In melee, you dodge your enemy's combo and then attack. You can break from this pattern, but it rarely ends well. The issue is that the game doesn't make up for the enemy's predictable movesets with a wider, more interesting moveset for the player. The moves you can use on your turn are so limited that there's no excitement for when I get to hit back, which is a massive misstep in a game like this that has a focus on melee combat. In Sifu, not only is dodging a challenge in and of itself, but I have so many combat options that I can unleash all kinds of devastation on my enemies, to the point they won't even get another chance to hit back if I'm good enough. Once I've fought an enemy a few times, I know the most effective way to win the fight, but because I have so many moves, there are multiple ways to get there which can keep things interesting. Now, Dead Space may seem like a slightly odd comparison to make in this regard, because it doesn't really have an in-depth melee system, but what Dead Space does have is combat variety. Ignoring enemy variety for a second, Isaac has quite a wide toolkit made up of weapons that all interact with enemies differently. The plasma cutter is useful for precision limb removal, and although it can fire quite fast, it's rare that it ever hits more than one enemy at once. But the line gun more than makes up for that with a much wider beam that can penetrate several foes or remove both legs or arms in one shot. The trade-off is that its cost per shot is higher, it fires slower, has lower ammo capacity, and requires a longer reload. Once you acquire one, you can spice up Callisto's combat by using your guns, but it's not something I ever felt the game was pushing me towards consistently due to the ease and simplicity of melee combat. There's only 3 enemy types in the whole game that require ranged combat, 2 of which are bosses, and 1 of which only showed up occasionally past the halfway point of the game. What kills the tension of this combat more than any other factor is that you do not have to time your dodges. If the enemy is throwing out a combo, then you simply move back and forth with each attack and you will never take damage. How the game dresses this up does a lot to make it seem more engaging than it really is, especially when you consider how good the gore effects are, so instead of this, picture if you will a rhythm game on easy mode where you don't actually have to hit the notes on time, you simply hold the button until the note gets there and then hold the next button, and the song only has 2 different notes you need to hit, and they come at a very even pace. That's what this dodge mechanic is, and once you realize that, it becomes mind-numbing within the first few hours, and is made far worse by the lack of variety in the kinds of attacks enemies will throw at you. Wait, what's this footage of The Last of Us 2 doing here? Begone, foul demon.
Out of this house!
I'll go into more depth later, but suffice it to say they all have similar, or in some cases identical, attack patterns. The only major difference is being that some will throw out more attacks by default, and some throw out less. There aren't certain generic enemy types that attack significantly faster or slower. They don't feint, and they don't use undodgeable moves that you have to block, or vice versa. They just attack you in the exact same way every single time, which more often than not lets me killing them in the exact same way every single time.
It's so boring! Damn it, Wade!
Now, the next step up from fighting one enemy is group encounters. And something I was expecting from this game when I first played it was that melee would be suitable for one-on-ones, but become a last resort in group fights, with your guns instead being required to safely take down multiple foes lest they swarm you. However, one of the first fights in the game is a 3-on-1 before you even get a gun, and it changes almost nothing about how you fight. In group encounters, enemies will sit and wait their turn while you fight them one at a time, even on hard and hardcore difficulty. They don't rush you at the same time, at least not intentionally. They also can't restrict your dodges by surrounding you, meaning there isn't even an incentive to keep them in your field of view, because as long as I keep fighting the enemy in front of me, the ones around me are unlikely to attack, and if they do, they're easy to dodge. Which basically means the strategy for your average group fight is the exact same as it is in one-on-ones, with the only real difference being how long it takes to get through them. As long as there's no acid spitter or exploder in play, which there frequently isn't, then you may as well just be fighting one enemy with a much larger health bar. When the game is working as intended, there is no situation in which it's possible for melee enemies to overwhelm you with sheer numbers, as long as you stick to a rigorous pattern and don't get cheeky by trying to counterattack early. Except for one move.
You little fuck!
Enemies have a grab they will occasionally throw out, and there's no counter to it short of shooting them in the face, which sounds pretty good, until you realize their grab goes off instantaneously once they're in range, and if they're moving towards you, it's hard to tell if they're doing it just to do a normal attack, or if they're doing it to grab you. Thankfully, if you do the QTE fast enough, it barely does any damage, even on hardcore mode, but this just feels like a missed opportunity.
I'm trying to understand, like, how do you know when something's about to lunge at you? That's the question I have. Oh well, I'll figure it out. It'll be intuitive. Maybe.
This grab isn't telegraphed. Why? Why not give normal monsters a unique sound cue like a yell and an animation to signal they're winding up to a grab, to give the player fair warning so they can counter it more effectively? All that would do is make the fight more interesting, because now I'd have a specific counter to a specific move, and it would require ammo to pull off, which would be an incentive to not just sell my ammo whenever I get to a store. In addition to not needing to care about whether enemies are surrounding you, you also don't have to consider the general environment when dodging either. Now, there are environmental hazards in the game that will kill you instantly if you get careless, which I like, especially because you can also use them on enemies, but I'm not talking about them right now. When I say you don't have to consider the environment, I mean the game lets you dodge like this. The game allows you to dodge into a wall and still avoid damage. The game never restricts the direction in which it allows you to dodge. Why not make it so that your dodge has to put some distance between you and the damage source in order to work? Yes, doing what I'm suggesting would limit your options, but that's the point. As it stands, there is only one enemy in the whole game you cannot deal with using melee. This is a system that sorely needs some limitations in what you can use it for. I think if you're caught between a wall and another enemy, then it should prevent you from dodging in either direction, which would not only force you to actually use the block mechanic against normal enemies, but it would also incentivize you to use your guns more frequently to kill enemies faster, because getting surrounded would now actually be a threat, since there's a higher chance they're going to restrict your dodges. I'm not saying the game has to do this, but I don't think it's controversial to say that this change would add some much needed complexity to this combat system, because the way things are, the only time I ever consciously reposition myself in this game is when the camera's jammed up against a wall and I can't see, or I'm trying to throw an enemy into a spike wall and I want to waste as little of my telekinesis as possible, which is a huge missed opportunity, because in many melee-focused games, good positioning can mean the difference between victory and defeat. My chances should be far better in this game if I'm frequently moving to the outside of a group of enemies versus standing right in the middle of them. But instead, my chances don't change at all. It's just ignoring an entire dimension to combat. And speaking of positioning, because you can't control your dodge and it just goes off automatically, very frequently your movement is interrupted by a string of attacks you're gonna have to dodge, and as a result, repositioning is far more finicky than it has any right to be. It's far from impossible, but there are so many times in this game where I've been unable to move where I want because an enemy is attacking. This is especially irritating if you're trying to set someone up for an environmental kill. To waste as little telekinesis as possible, you obviously want them between you and the hazard. But if you're dealing with multiple enemies, there's a good chance you're going to be dodging from combo to combo and ending up wherever the wind takes you. And that could still be an engaging system if it was challenging to dodge, but it isn't, so it isn't. Now, I introduced the melee system at its simplest, but it really doesn't get much more complicated than that. You can unlock a heavy attack and a block breaker early on, but the block breaker isn't actually an attack you have control over. It just means that if the enemy tries to block, you'll take their arm off automatically during your attack. Which makes melee even less difficult because you can invest in this upgrade early and prevent enemies from blocking for the rest of the entire game. The heavy attack, meanwhile, I would actually call broken. A lot of encounters in this game happen in relatively confined quarters, and if you hit an enemy with the heavy attack, they go flying. But usually, walls will stop them from going the full distance, and if you're close enough, you can follow up with a normal melee combo. But if you choose not to complete the combo and only throw out one or two attacks, you get to hit them with another heavy and send them flying again. Using this, you can combo any normal enemy into oblivion and they can't get free. It's a potentially unending combo that you can use to just bully enemies in any normal encounter to death, and it costs you nothing. How this got into the game, I do not know, because it simply removes an enemy's ability to fight back as long as there's a wall nearby, which there frequently is. Rather hilariously, the infinite heavy normal combo is just as broken in group fights, but in a new and interesting way. If you launch an enemy and start a normal combo, there's a good chance the game is going to lock you onto the next closest enemy, even if they are directly behind you, which causes Jacob to do a hilarious 180 as he immediately turns to face them. Usually, enemies you weren't previously focused on won't be readying an attack either, meaning if you have the block break, then you just do a half combo, launch them with a heavy, and since the other enemy will be getting back up, you just keep the train rolling until one of them dies, at which point you just bully the remaining enemy like normal. It's so incredibly overpowered. You can use it on all but 3 enemies in the whole game. Everybody else is susceptible to this attack. And those 3 enemies I mentioned show up infrequently. They don't show up rarely, but they're definitely not the main enemy type. Hell, one of them's a fucking boss enemy. Now, there is one more melee attack you can unlock in this game, and guns with upgradable alt-fire modes, which I'll talk about later. But I want this stated now in no uncertain terms. Against normal enemies, they are all worse than the strategy I just mentioned because they waste resources. The infinite heavy normal is the best strategy in this game, and you can get it almost as soon as you unlock the stun baton. Now, on the subject of combos, something that really bothers me that I mentioned earlier is Jacob's inconsistent combo length. When you begin, you can perform a 3-attack combo at maximum, which can be quickly upgraded to 4, and once you acquire it, Jacob will throw out his upgraded 4-attack combo. Well, but no he won't. Oh, but then he will. And sometimes, if he's not feeling it, he'll just do 2 attacks, and you've just got to deal with it. If you begin attacking an enemy as they're getting up from the floor, you can, in some cases, get out a 5-attack combo, but that doesn't seem to be an intentional design choice. Instead, it seems that if you attack as the enemy is standing up, then the game won't count that first attack as part of a combo. The downside is it's quite possible you're going to miss with it, but if it does, you lose nothing, and your next attack once they get up will begin your combo as normal. But this random combo length poses a bigger issue than simply taking control away from the player with an inconsistent moveset. If my combo is going to change length arbitrarily, then it becomes impossible to know whether I'll be able to finish low health enemies consistently. With multiple enemies at play and no health bars, it naturally becomes difficult to track who you've damaged. Thankfully, when enemies are on low health, they lose an arm and only attack once. However, because of the inconsistent combo length, I could never know if by countering them I would be able to kill them or not. If Jacob decided to perform a 2-hit combo, they would almost certainly live. 3 and above meant I'd have a decent chance of killing them, on normal difficulty at least. On hard, I usually needed that 4-hit combo to get a kill, but it simply didn't go off most of the time. And this would be an easy problem to fix. Like Dead Space, Callisto is clearly invested in having the game's UI presented diegetically. Your health and TK levels are stamped into your neck and your ammo count is displayed next to your gun. They don't want enemy health bars unless it can be justified as something Jacob would see in-universe. But once you get your armor, there's no reason not to have prisoner HP levels displayed next to them, and you could easily justify it as the helmet's visor providing the guards with a shorthand to see if any prisoners are injured. Either that, or have Elias upgrade Jacob's clearance so the prison thinks he's a guard, and so provides him with HP readings on all prisoners. There are so many ways to justify health bars, and in a game that requires you to use melee and requires you to get up close to enemies, I'd say they're a must, because they would allow you to make tactical choices about which enemies you focus on in the heat of battle. Normally this wouldn't be much of an issue because enemies wait their turn in combat, unless of course there's an acid spitter in play, which do not wait their turn when it comes to firing their acid. If there is, then getting the kill or only knocking them back can literally mean the difference between taking damage and making it out safely, which is extremely unsatisfying in a game with an emphasis on resource management because it puts me at the whims of the game. In something like Red Dead 2, I don't care if Arthur throws out a terrible combo because I have tons of health which regenerates. In Dead Space, there are no combos, and you can completely rely on Isaac attacking in a consistent pattern once you start mashing the button. In Callisto, if I get hit because Jacob isn't quite feeling like a proper length combo for whatever reason, all that does is encourage me to cheese the game's combat, because if I try relying on Jacob using the proper length combos, then the game might just choose to screw me at random intervals and I'd have to waste resources to heal back up. As you'd expect in a game with a decent focus on melee, you obviously have more than one combo you can do. And here it is. Basically, you have to block the last attack in an enemy's combo and counter to strike their legs. That's it. It's not even really a combo, is it? It's a counter attack. But even this has problems. This attack has one major flaw, which is that all enemies in this game, much like Jacob himself, have random attack patterns. They could do 1, 2, or 3 attack combos, and there's no way of telling which hit will be their last, because they don't telegraph any differently, which cripples an attack like this that relies on you knowing when their combo will end.
Uh-oh. How am I supposed to know if it's a series of attacks and not? Oh.
The non-existent telegraphing means if you want to use this combo, you either have to guess when they will finish correctly every time you want to use it, or block every attack that comes in, meaning you will take reduced damage from each hit. And no, this has nothing to do with whether the enemy has both their arms, and no, this has nothing to do with evolution, which is a mechanic I'll get around to eventually. You see that shit? He just evolved, he has both his arms, and he only attacked me once. How can I use this combo consistently when I can't tell which attack will be their last? But even ignoring that, I would argue you are disincentivized from using this move fundamentally, because the most effective combo you could ever ask for is the infinite heavy normal, and this is a game in which you're supposed to value your resources. Yes, I would argue the heavy normal is technically an exploit and not a real combo, since you can't find it anywhere in the tutorials section, and the game never acknowledges it otherwise. But it's an exploit that is still in the game after this long, and it's legitimately difficult to avoid discovering it, because all it requires is for you to try attacking normally after pulling a heavy attack off, and then trying it again to see if Jacob can launch the enemy again. This is something most people will find one way or another, and once you figure out how it works, there is zero reason to use this move, because it's less reliable, harder to pull off, and takes a little bit of health because blocking only reduces the amount of damage you take. Fun fact, when I first wrote this section, I did so thinking there were 2 other combos in the game. Then I actually checked again, and nope, there's one. I managed to overestimate the game at 2 combos. 2. A lot of the problems I've mentioned thus far are mitigated slightly once you get a ranged weapon, because you unlock the ability to do a follow-up after your combo with whatever weapon you have equipped. It's as simple as it sounds, but it can make up for Jacob only doing a 2-hit combo when you needed more. It gives some control back to the player, but I would argue it helps solve a problem that shouldn't exist in the first place. And in Callisto, your weapons are all very standard fare for an over-the-shoulder shooter, which does not help arouse my interest. You have a pistol, a shotgun, a pistol, and an assault rifle. And no, I didn't just have a stroke and accidentally say pistol and shotgun twice there. The game gives you a small and large version of each for some reason, instead of something a little more interesting. You can upgrade them, but only the last upgrade actually changes anything significant about the guns. And before I actually get into what the upgrades do, I want to say, I really love the whole 3D printing upgrades idea conceptually, and it's really cool to watch new bits get added on as you upgrade your guns. But why does it take so long? Dead Space 2 and the Dead Space remake had the same problem when it came to changing suits. It takes an age because there's no way to preview how the suit will look without putting it on. Here, the same issue exists if you want to go on a spending spree, but for some reason you can't purchase multiple upgrades at once despite the fact there is no reason the upgrades couldn't be added concurrently or simultaneously. If you decide to get the 3 cheap telekinesis or melee upgrades, you have to sit through the same upgrade animation 3 separate times, despite the fact baton and TK upgrades don't even change how the thing looks. Spending lots of money on upgrades should be a kind of exciting thing, but instead it bored me, and obviously there are many people who are going to find the whole process very satisfying, and I did too, just not 10 times in a row on my 2nd, 3rd, and 4th playthroughs. Anyway, as I mentioned, the guns in this game are as stock as they come. This is a futuristic, spacefaring prison colony, and yet we don't get to play around with any thematically appropriate high-tech riot suppression gear beyond a stun baton. There is so much that you could do weapons-wise with this concept, and none of it is realised. What about giving me a fully automatic taser rifle with a separate energy bar so you can electrocute enemies you've shot at will? Or a hyper-powered rubber bullet shotgun with crazy knockback that can push enemies into walls and environmental hazards but does terrible damage otherwise? Or an electric net gun that can disable an enemy or two for an extended period of time but does a little damage and requires a long reload, making it useful once per fight? Or a caltrop grenade that cripples enemies' movement and instantly pops exploders if they try to crawl across them. We don't even get flashbangs or smoke grenades or tear gas. Not even improvised throwables like Molotovs or something. There is so much you could do weapons-wise with the futuristic prison colony concept, and they did nothing. You can still have all the lethal stuff in there, but why not put some non-lethal riot suppression gear in the arsenal to spice things up a little more? And as far as upgrades go, they aren't exactly that interesting either. Each gun has 4 potential upgrades, 3 of which are exactly the same for each gun. They just appear in a different order each time. One of them is always a damage upgrade, one is always a mag capacity upgrade, and one is always a stability upgrade, which only really make it better at what it was already doing. The 4th upgrade, meanwhile, is always the interesting one because it gives you an alt-fire mode unique to each weapon, and, well, let's just say it being the interesting one is relative, and it being unique is also relative. The hand cannon and the big boy shotgun get explosive shots, the small shotgun and the assault rifle both get homing rounds, and finally the small pistol gets a 5-round burst. If you're starting to fall asleep a little bit, don't worry, I'm right there with you. When I tested these all out, I was expecting some kind of difference between the similar upgrades, but the only difference between the explosives is that the pistol shot has a slight delay, and the shotgun just shreds everything instantly. And I couldn't even find a noticeable difference between the homing rounds. So you actually get 2 guns with the same explosive shot and 2 with the same homing bullets.
It's so...
Could you not come up with anything more interesting? What about a mine-laying gun? What about a tripwire gun? What about a gun that fires a tiny little turret on the wall? What about like one that fires a stasis grenade on the ground? I'm just literally off the top of my head. However, I will say that fundamentally, the guns in this game are very satisfying to use, especially the hand cannon, and thankfully it's the first gun you get. It sounds great, it hits hard, and this is such a small detail, but I really appreciate that each shot leaves behind this dispersing trail in the air, like your shot was so powerful it did something weird to the air itself. The feeling of power is also helped by the excellent gore effects. In this game, your guns serve more than just a practical purpose and are in fact your main weapon in the fight against boredom, which, despite what the game's narrative claims, is your actual main antagonist for the game. Maintaining control over your own boredom is a legitimate challenge in this game. If you try and take the initiative because of it and attack an enemy without dodging their combo first, there's a good chance you're gonna get hit. Ignore the rigorous pattern and you will likely be punished, which is just miserable for someone like me who plays survival games as efficiently as possible to preserve resources. Like, yeah, pulling out the revolver and blowing this guy's head off would be fun, but I have no reason to do that. He's not tough to kill at all with melee, so using my gun would just be a waste. If the melee system were more expansive, I might be okay with just using the baton, but that's not the case, and as I found out once I did get bored, trading with these guys is far from viable. I just wanna have fun!
No! No fun! A waste of money!
At this point, you may be wondering, well, surely the game makes up for it with a decent roster of enemies, so let's go through them. You've got normal dudes, acid spitters, which are the only ranged enemies, fat dudes with more health, invisible crawlers, blind guys, and explodey guys, which are the only enemies that can't be killed with melee. Melee is suboptimal against the spitters as well, but still viable enough. The other enemies can be killed effectively with melee in the exact same way, and they don't have any special resistances either. Yes, even the invisible guys. So if you played this game, my condolences, and wasted ammo on them, then that's exactly what you did. Wasted ammo. Because dodging their attacks is just as simple as with every other enemy. Just strafe until they attack and Jacob will dodge it like he's a champion boxer, despite the fact they were literally invisible up until the last second. I'll talk about the other enemies in a sec, but I really want to start with the invisible dudes, even though they aren't introduced first, because they are bafflingly designed. It seems like a no-brainer to make melee ineffective against these freaks, because they rely on ambushing you, and to that end, they can crawl on the walls and ceilings. But they don't have any ranged moves that would make them a threat from those positions. They can jump on you from the ceiling, but if you do the QTE fast enough, as far as I can tell, you take no damage. And if they attack you after, then they're open to a counter. So why can they do it then? Just to look cool? Well, they're invisible most of the time, so that can't be it. Is it to make taking random pot shots even less likely to hit since they could be anywhere? I guess that makes sense, but why don't they have any ranged attacks? At first, the dominant strategy is just to shoot them when they move, since that's when they're visible. But once you figure out you can just beat them to death, that all goes away. Why would I waste ammo when I can just go bonk mad? I was expecting that they'd be kind of like the ranged dog enemies in Dead Space that can crawl on the walls, because then you would have to more regularly examine your environment, and it would actually make them unique amongst this game's enemy pool. They're unique now, but only in how they move. You still deal with them the exact same way as all the others. The normal guys, the fat guys, and the acid guys can all evolve if they take enough melee damage. Evolution means they get a bigger health bar, more damage, and regrow any arms they might have lost. You can either let them and play the rhythm game, or take a shot at their face tentacles while they're evolving to kill them instantly when they turn. And I quite like that. It's a decent mechanic which encourages you to vary up your playstyle for an easier time, and it requires a skill check because you have a very small window to hit the tentacles before they turn. Still, the variety is sorely lacking here, not necessarily in terms of how many enemies there are, but in how you approach them. Dead Space had far more enemy variety, and you would be hard-pressed to call the roster in Dead Space bloated. Different enemies filled unique roles, and sometimes had unique mechanics, with many requiring specific techniques to take down safely that would be wasteful against other enemies. Two good examples are the Divider and the Pregnant. The Divider is a necromorph made up of 5 different entities coming together to form a tall, emaciated monster. At the first sign of notable damage, it collapses, and the surviving appendages will independently attack Isaac and are now much harder to hit, which makes precision weapons awkward at best and explosive or area damage weapons ideal. However, you would be crazy to use a weapon like that against a Pregnant, unless you're willing to follow up with many more explosives, because upon sustaining damage to its torso, it'll birth a clutch of swarmers that attach to Isaac, and slow him down while dealing damage, which is far from ideal in the midst of combat, especially when you consider that they usually travel with at least one other necromorph, and can even survive the birth and continue attacking the player. For skilled players, precision weapons are key here, and for those that aren't confident in their precision aiming skills, the flamethrower can help remove the threat of the swarmers cheaply if the torso is damaged, which is why, in the remake, you get it for free around the time they start showing up. What I'm trying to convey here is that Dead Space has layers of complexity and strategy that don't exist in Callisto due to the homogeny of the small enemy pool and the overpowered melee combat. The exploders make melee useless, which I like, but they appear very infrequently and always took me by surprise as a result. I would have switched up my playstyle to deal with them, but half the time I only realised they were in play when it was too late. Oh, and just adding on to the whole repositioning thing, there is nothing more irritating than getting stuck in a combo just as an exploder rounds the corner, because you're gonna take damage now, you're gonna get blown up, and you've just gotta deal with it. However, I will say that a fucking distinctive sound cue wouldn't have gone amiss.
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.
This little prick only caught me by surprise because he doesn't have an easily distinguishable sound cue. In Callisto, the normal guys can be killed effectively with melee or by shooting them with your guns. The fat guys can be killed effectively with melee or by shooting them with your guns. The blind guys can be killed effectively with melee or by shooting them with your guns. The invisible dudes can be killed effectively with melee, but shooting them is a bit more difficult for obvious reasons. The acid spitters can be hard to close the distance on, but can be killed effectively with any of your guns that aren't shotguns, for obvious reasons of range. Well, until you get homing rounds for one of your shotguns, which... why is that an upgrade that is attached to a shotgun? Could you not think of something more appropriate? And finally, the exploders cannot be killed with melee, but can be killed with any of your guns. There are some differences here, but the first 2 enemy types on that list make up the vast majority of what you're going to encounter throughout the game, and they require the same fucking strategy. Actually, the only difference between the first two enemy types and the blind guys is that the blind guys are unsurprisingly extremely vulnerable to stealth, but to like a laughable degree. You have to be kidding me. I didn't even move. And you missed me. You walked in. Oh, comment. Once you get into combat, they home in on you because they can presumably hear you moving around. However, they can't hear that. I don't have too much to really say about them. I think just showing these clips makes my point better than I ever could. I have so many of these. These enemies are a joke.
Why do I get the feeling that someday I'll be describing this to a psychiatrist?
Do I even need to say anything? The game locks me into the world's longest kill animation, and honestly, it looks like I get killed before the animation is even over, but I'm gonna be generous and say it probably happened the millisecond it finished. This happens every now and again throughout the game. Rarely is it quite as bullshit as this, but it's still a problem. Enemies will lock you into animations. And perhaps because they had an attack queued up as it started, or because something just went a bit wrong in the game's scripts, another enemy will attack you literally as it finishes and you simply have to take damage. That's fucking thank you, game, so much. I love it. I can't wait to play it again. I love this game.
I would really not be screaming that at the top of your lungs.
This is especially a problem with the acid spitters, who will more regularly spit on you right as you get out of either a grab or a kill animation, and sometimes you'll get locked into these animations when you don't want to be. If I attack a normal enemy because they ran up on me, accidentally kill them, and end up in a long animation only to get spat on, that's not cool, because I didn't want to kill them if it meant taking damage and the game just screwed me. If I'd rolled better and gotten a faster kill animation, I might have been okay. Now, before moving on, there's something you may have noticed in that clip that just went, and that is me swinging when I'm obviously out of step. I should not expect to hit this guy when I'm so far away, and obviously the game doesn't give me the hit. So, why did I do it? Well, occasionally, this game has wildly inconsistent tracking to the point that there is no real way for me to tell which attacks will hit and which ones won't. Yes, the melee system is still broken in a few more ways. There have been times where the game won't give me attacks when my enemy is literally standing right in front of me, and there have been times where they are either about a full meter away from me or around a corner, and the game will just magnetize me towards them to give me the hit. This clip is the cleanest example I've ever seen of it fucking up both ways, and what this means is that I cannot even rely on my attacks hitting consistently. So what I end up doing is just taking any opportunity I have to get a hit, because distance doesn't actually mean anything in this game. You could be miles away and the game might still give you the hit, and the kind of attitude that this inconsistency encourages is the main reason I get hit here. There was no real way to tell if the game would have tracked me onto the spitter or not, so I rolled the dice and got unlucky, which is part of what got me comboed and destroyed there. But thankfully, even when the tracking system messes up massively, this doesn't happen all that frequently, and there is a good strategy to dealing with acid spitters which further mitigates this issue, which I might as well talk about now. I've talked around them enough, so let's actually go into the acid spitters. The normal enemy types are all pretty similar. Even when they evolve, they only really have more health and damage, but what throws a wrench into the works are these things. They can be irritating to the nth degree because of their undodgeable acid spit. You can block it just like any other attack and it will do reduced damage, but there's no actual dodge move for it. You can dodge it by just walking to the side, but if an enemy is attacking, then that goes out the window. And you've just got to hope that your dodge animation will move you enough to get you out of the way of the spit. Closing the distance can also be annoying when other enemies are close to you, because more often than not, you'll be forced to dodge their attacks instead, and by the time they're done with their combo, if you haven't already taken damage, more acid is incoming. However, they can actually friendly fire, which is pretty entertaining, I must admit.
Oh, I'm okay with that. Good job, game.
What I just described, however, is how combat with them goes if you restrict yourself to just melee, which is easily the worst way to deal with these guys. The game expects you to either use your guns or your grip, which is essentially a much shorter use but stronger Dead Space kinesis. They're designed to be taken on at range, and alongside the exploding guys, they are also the only normal enemy type in the game that is designed this way. What I usually did was open with a shot to the head with my hand cannon, which can take their head clean off on normal difficulty and prevent them from spitting entirely, which I like as a tactical choice, but I think it's a bit easy to do. Honestly, it would be interesting to lock that ability behind a certain tier of upgrade in the upgrade tree. Why not have one of the upgrades designed to specifically take off enemy heads, and then the game gives you a tooltip that says, hey, doing this to acid spitters can be really useful. But as it stands, I definitely don't hate it as a design choice. I just wanted a bit more than you shoot the head and they stop spitting. I probably wouldn't if the game had a more expansive enemy pool, but because this game has so few enemies, I want each one to have as many mechanics as possible. Funnily enough, with the spitters, evolution can actually be something of a mercy, because if you cause them to evolve, they can no longer spit acid, which is an odd design choice that actually makes them easier after evolution. Like, normal dudes turning into this, I'm fine with, but why don't acid spitters turn into a more powerful version of what they were? Why not have them evolve into a volatile creature that will explode if the player gets too close? Give them an acid spray move where they projectile vomit into the air and cover a cone in front of them with acid spit instead of it being projectile. So then it's almost guaranteed to hurt other enemies as well as you. Instead, they just turn into the big claw guy again, which is boring. The only other recurring main enemy type I can think of are the foreskin monsters. These probably have a name, but that's what I started calling it and it stuck. For, well, obvious reasons. If you get in range, they will jump out and latch on. Stab them 6 times with the QTE and they will die and you get loot but lose a bit of health. If you spot them ahead of time, you can shoot them and just get the loot. Sounds like an okay enemy that encourages you to examine your environment. But there are moments where the game puts them in places you literally cannot react to in time. I can't shoot this thing from the ladder. I can't shoot it from the other side of the door. I have to climb up, and when I do, it grabs me. I knew it was there, it was just impossible for me to get my gun out in time. Very minor dick move, game. And that's the game's main roster of enemies, covered in as much detail as I feel they deserve. I skipped over the normal melee dudes and the fat guys because I've essentially already covered them at the beginning of this video. I explained how the main mechanics work, and that is all you need to do to defeat them. They just have random 1 to 3 attack combos, they grab you occasionally, they can evolve and they die pretty easily. Not much more to say. It's not the most expansive roster, and these enemies also have very limited movesets, and to reiterate, yes, Dead Space Necromorphs also have quite limited movesets, but there are so many more varieties of Necromorph that you have to learn to deal with. If you're gonna have such a small enemy pool, why not give them more interesting moves? Why not give the evolved guys a crisscross slash that's undodgeable, and then an unblockable, and make the combos he currently has distinctly telegraphed so I can actually tell what they're gonna fucking do? Actually, just do that for all the enemies. Telegraphing is so important in a melee-focused game because it allows you to respond appropriately to an enemy's attack based on what they're doing. It's just another aspect of the game you have to learn and get good at. It's just extra combat depth for free, basically. And then why not give the invisible guys range moves? You know, just all the most basic attacks you typically expect to get in games. But for all of my complaining about enemies' limited movesets, there is one that truly exemplifies this problem. One who I have avoided talking about up to now because he is so embarrassingly designed, I just had to give him his own section. Meet Greg. Greg is one of 2 boss enemies in the game, one of which is the final boss. Greg, on the other hand, is not unique. He is repeated 3 separate times throughout the game with almost no mechanical variation between each of the fights. He's vulnerable to bullets and explosives, but not melee. He has 1 attack. That is Greg's combo. That is the only move he has. To dodge it, you move left or right. You don't even have to alternate. By and large, bosses are supposed to be a test of your skills. Have you learned the lessons the game has been teaching you? In Metal Gear Rising, Monsoon's fight asks, have you learned to parry consistently? If the answer is no, you're not getting past him without a lot of cheese. The Mr. Freeze fight in Arkham City asks if you can consistently get the drop on a powerful foe with a shrinking pool of viable stealth moves. It forces you to prove that you can incorporate the majority of Batman's available stealth takedowns into a single encounter, and since it's difficult to avoid Freeze the whole time, you also have to escape from him. Greg asks, can you strafe? Are you capable of aiming and firing a gun? Which, if you've reached him, are 2 things you've already proven you're capable of. So, what about his second phase? Nothing changes. Like, that's it. What is there to say about this embarrassment of a boss other than that? They throw some more enemies in once you reach phase 2 from the second encounter onwards, but it really doesn't change much because it's just like any normal multi-enemy encounter, only one of the enemies has way more health and does way more damage. Hypothetically, even if this boss had some notable, interesting mechanics and was fun to fight, you're gonna have to fucking use your imagination for this one. It's still missing something big that Dead Space's bosses had, and that is any kind of setup. Every time you fight Greg, he just shows up abruptly. There's no significance to encountering him after the first fight, and his existence never affects the direction of the narrative in any meaningful way. It doesn't have to, but that was one of the ways Dead Space gave significance to its boss encounters. In Dead Space, major bosses are not only built up through dialogue and text and audio logs before you actually fight them, but some of them are placed directly in Isaac's path as something that actually change his goals and his strategy, because they're preventing him from achieving his wider goals on the Ishimura. Isaac doesn't want to deal with the Leviathan. He has other pressing concerns that will bring him closer to escaping the ship, but he has to because allowing it to live means no oxygen. So your goals change and you end up in hydroponics for a chapter. Both in the original and the remake, before fighting the Leviathan, Isaac also spends a while running around hydroponics trying to counteract the effects the monster is having, restore oxygen to the ship, and kill it without ever having to actually fight it. Him going in there after the poison doesn't work was a last resort, and because the narrative point of the previous section was to avoid a direct encounter, it naturally builds tension. Fighting it directly is suicide, so we're going to poison it. Oh, the Leviathan didn't die, but we still have to deal with it. You're going to have to fight it now. Here's to hoping the poison weakened it enough. Now, the boss itself, not that difficult in either version of the game, but the build-up makes it memorable, makes it interesting, even if it isn't difficult gameplay-wise. I wouldn't dislike Greg as much as I do if he were the equivalent of how Dead Space uses the Brute, where he's an incidental boss enemy the first time you fight him, and then as the game goes on he shows up infrequently as a special enemy, with actual bosses like the Leviathan having more effort put into them and their areas. But Greg is all this game has outside of the final boss, and you'd hope that with that being the case they might at least bring back the same enemy as like a relentless hunter that just keeps getting stronger and coming back for more. Kinda like how in the Dead Space remake, instead of getting blown off the station at the end of its fight, the Leviathan attaches to the comms array and has another boss fight later instead of it being the slug from the original game. But no, you just kill 3 different Gregs throughout the game, and they are barely any more remarkable than all the standard enemies. This is obviously anecdotal, but as I was writing this, I was genuinely having trouble remembering where I fought the 3rd guy. I've played this game more than any human should, and I have footage of all 3 of his fights, but I couldn't remember the last one because he's just moping around a server room. There's no build-up, and there's no interesting set piece. At the very least, the first one shows up on the Horde mode drill platform, which is noteworthy, and the second one attacks Danny in a cutscene, which pretty much instantly raised him to my favourite character. This one is just there. Holy shit, wait, there's 4. Oh, I just remembered there's 4. Oh my, there's 4 of them. I have footage of all 4 of these fights. I had trouble remembering one, but they're literally so unremarkable I forgot one. Like, again, anecdotal, but I shouldn't be able to forget boss encounters, and I completely forgot the fan room guy existed. Right, So, if that doesn't make the point that this game needed some more interesting encounters, that I could literally forget boss fights after 4 full playthroughs, I don't know what would. At this point, I've covered most of my main issues with this combat system, but one of my biggest problems with it is that the melee-focused combat is fundamentally at odds with this game's goals, because it is really hard to maintain tension if there's no threat to the majority of enemies getting close to you. When you encounter a necromorph in Dead Space, regardless of the enemy type, an invisible clock has been started on you where the challenge is kill it before it can damage you. The majority of tension in combat comes from fighting melee-focused enemies because the simple act of them getting in your face is a worry, since Isaac relies on ranged weaponry. As you progress through the game and the evolved necromorphs come into play along with the absurdly fast twitchers, that timer gets significantly shorter, and part of what makes Dead Space intense is that it's not good enough to simply hit your targets. You have to target the most mobile areas of their bodies in order to dismember them, because that's the most effective strategy. Anything else and you'd just be wasting ammo. When an enemy gets close in Dead Space, it's likely to make you panic, because that means you've failed the challenge and targeting their limbs is now harder than ever. The timer has run out, and now you've either got to run or melee enemies. And the thing about Dead Space is, there is no real melee system. It's designed entirely as a last resort with no dedicated upgrades or real mechanics beyond pressing attack over and over. Dead Space's melee system is actually far simpler than Callisto's, but that's fine because the game doesn't want you to use it as anything but a desperate fallback. Callisto, on the other hand, heavily pushes you towards its overpowered melee system. Now, I will admit the melee in Dead Space is overpowered in the remake, and if you abuse stasis you can kill quite a few necromorphs with it no problem, so yes, I would argue that it is technically overpowered. But that's an issue with the game that could be fixed by just changing an integer, which I'm sure they'll do for the Dead Space 2 remake. Like, surely they're not gonna fuck that one up again, right? Callisto's melee system, on the other hand, has fundamental problems that require mechanics to be redesigned in order to fix them. Because in Callisto, there is no such tension when an enemy shows up, and no such panic when they get close. In fact, letting them close the gap is the dominant strategy, because dodging their attacks is so trivial to the point that the only enemy in this game that actually makes me tense up a bit is the acid spitter, because I can't rely on the overpowered dodge mechanic to avoid their spit. And if I'm fighting other enemies, it can be difficult to reliably avoid their attacks and block the spit due to Jacob's slow movement and the lack of a player-controlled dodge function. I panic in Dead Space when I hear monsters behind me, especially if there's already one in front of me, because it means I'm trapped, and I need to relocate quickly or kill them before I take damage. Here, there are no such concerns. Why would I move when I could just... They can't touch me, it's literally that simple. Without an acid spitter in play, this combat has almost no tension, which really harms the horror aspect of this survival horror. It can't be understated that once I was used to fighting with melee, I felt like the Terminator, which is not a feeling I would expect to be getting from a survival horror very often. It can be fun to turn the tide once in a while, but if I start this powerful and I'm only going to be getting stronger throughout the game, then you end up with the Evil Within 1, but with way less mechanics. Actually, that's not even true, because you start off underpowered in the Evil Within 1, to the point you only have a couple bullets.
I said you don't see a thing! Oh god, he sees a thing. Abushki! Woohoo! Oh, I split your head right open! Oh god, that didn't do the trick. How do I melee? How do I melee? Oh, I'm out of bullets! Oh, I'm in a panic situation!
It takes quite a few hours before it turns into an action game, but that's besides the point. Also, Rip Tango. I guess we're never getting Evil Within 3. At least not in the way it was meant to be made. To finish evaluating the melee system, I really am struggling to convey the mindlessness with which I fought enemies in this game. I haven't shown any extended clips so far because it really is just the same thing every time and I don't want to bore the fuck out of anybody, but I'll do it just one time at the end here to show you what the average encounter is like. And so it's just attack, like, I want you to understand, when I attack, I am just mashing R1. That's all I'm doing. And hold left, R1, 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 R1. And then I stand there, wait for him to evolve. He just runs into me for no reason. hold left, hold right, hold left, and then counter again. And I'm just pressing R1. I pressed R2 there to do a heavy. How interesting. It's 3 buttons, essentially. And, like, the stick isn't a button, but, 3 inputs, really. You move the stick, left or right, doesn't really matter until the combo starts. You've got your light attack and your heavy attack. That's it. It's just... Like, I've already run out of things to commentate on in this fight. Thank God it was quick, because I have nothing more to say.
It's enough to make a man sick.
Oh, resource management. Normally in games, resource management is a problem that everyone is going to experience differently, because everybody has different levels of skill and different playstyles. I usually end up kind of drowning in resources in games like these, and Callisto was no exception, so instead of talking generally about it, I'm going to focus on one particular undeniable criticism, which is the reason that health and ammo was overly abundant for me was because melee combat was so easy that I never needed to use any of it. Yeah, if this weren't the case, I probably would have still ended up drowning because I'm careful with my resources, but even when I forced myself to be wasteful, I still ended up with a full inventory frequently, because melee combat doesn't cost you anything, which means plenty of other players would be having the same experience. So yeah, the problems with the bad melee system stretch into the other mechanics in this game and also corrupt them from how they would have originally worked. You could use your ammo, but why bother when melee is so effective? It's boring, sure, and the game clearly wants you to use ammo to stop enemies from evolving, but again, they don't really become that much more difficult. Hell, as I already mentioned, the acid spitters become easier. They do more damage, but their attacks are just as predictable as ever, and for that exact same reason, I rarely needed health either, because the only time I took damage was when I got bored and my concentration slipped, or when an acid spitter hit me. So, because of the small inventory size, what ended up happening was that I would be constantly selling stacks of ammo and health syringes from the very beginning to the very end of the game, which in turn helped finance early melee upgrades, which only made things even easier. It creates this kind of weird reward system where the game rewards you for not engaging with half of its main mechanics. Usually what you want is for a game to reward the player for mastery over the mechanics. For example, in the Arkham games, obviously, excluding the cursed devil child claiming to be part of the club, as Batman you get rewarded with extra experience for each gadget you incorporate into your combat. It incentivizes you to mix things up by allowing you to progress faster than players that simply go for a high combo, but only if you can pull off both. If you use 10 different gadgets but you get interrupted constantly, your score is gonna suck. I actually quite like the Arkham system, even though it's, a notoriously easy game series, because it encourages you to recognize and play at your personal highest level of skill. In something like Dead Space, you're incentivized to mix things up in general because the melee system purposefully sucks, and if you're on a higher difficulty, then you're gonna run out of ammo if you only stick to one gun, and you have others in your inventory. Meaning you will have to fall back on something else eventually, which encourages you to spread your upgrades around a little, especially because different enemies are susceptible to different guns in Dead Space, which is not something you can say for this game to the same extent. In Callisto, against normal enemies there is little incentive to use my guns for anything but acid spitters, and even then I frequently went for melee after taking the head off. Exploders do have to be dealt with at range, but they're a cheap one-shot kill who you can also pick up with the grip, and use to kill other enemies. There's not much incentive to use my guns beyond it looking cool, because if I save the ammo then I'll be able to sell it and buy more upgrades. And to be fair, that's absolutely possible in Dead Space, and you can buy an unhealthy amount of power nodes if you hoard the way I do. The difference between the two is that there are far more upgrades in Dead Space, meaning each power node is worth less. All you get in Dead Space is a bit more damage, slightly more ammo capacity or rate of fire. Each upgrade in Callisto is more significant, which isn't better or worse inherently. My problem is that the game rewards you the most for ignoring its mechanics, because that allows me to sell all the stuff I pick up instead of using some of it. In Dead Space, if I have an excess of ammo when I next get to a shop, then that's because I was efficient in dispatching enemies. It's my reward for using all the mechanics provided effectively, not for just ignoring my guns. And yes, I know, I said the melee in Dead Space is a lot better than it should be, but it's clearly not something the devs wanted you to rely on. And there are factors in Dead Space that mitigate this issue significantly that don't exist here. There are more enemies in Dead Space that require guns to fight that show up frequently. The enemies in Dead Space also rush you more often and don't wait their turn if they get behind you. The melee system also becomes very dangerous to use if you run out of stasis, which is bound to happen if you're constantly using it to melee enemies. Callisto wants you to use melee, which is weird because it trivializes combat and ruins the resource economy if you use it exclusively. And unlike in Dead Space, where the amount I can abuse melee is limited by how much stasis power I have, there is no limit in Callisto. Genuinely, I think a fix for this problem is to just make your melee a limited resource. Make the stun baton require battery packs to use which are drained whenever you engage in combat. That would unironically fix a lot of my issues once you balanced it properly, because you would have to then weigh your combat options more carefully and mix things up far more so that you don't run out of charge when you really need it. You could even make it so that you can recharge your stun baton at each store, but between each store the charge will deplete whenever you use it. It just bothers me that they put this in the game and just didn't realize how broken melee was. It seems so obvious when you play the game. Okay, this was originally supposed to be one video, but apparently my editing software finds this game as distasteful as I do, and it refused to render the whole thing, so, it's now two. Deal with it.